Is recording now. Welcome to the last week of the Transformers training group. So as usual, if the meeting ends before the 40-minute mark, you can join back using the exact same link. And that's it. Yep, that's it. Okay, cool. Let's start. So as always, we start by looking at the outline. We'll be looking at DEIT, which is like a more efficient form of vision transform. A dino, which is, I think, subjectively the coolest model I've ever seen. And then there's also DEIT. I think it's called DEIT, and that is a segmentation model that uses transformer. And I included segformer in the slides, but I do not think we have time to cover that. So I'm just gonna leave it there. You can look at it when you have time, but I won't cover it. Cool. This week will be, there's a lot of, there's two models that uses knowledge distillation in some way. So I thought it would be interesting to just cover this paper by just a little bit. This model is actually written by Hinton. Sorry. Yes, Jeffrey Hinton. There you go. It's written by Jeffrey Hinton a few years back. It's not really a paper that proposes new ways, new models or anything. It's just a way of training a model that is actually pretty interesting. So in the paper, he started with an analogy. So for a lot of insects, there's two forms. There's the larval form and there's the adult form. And the larval form is when it's just, I guess, a baby. As a larval, it's cumbersome. You don't really do a lot, but at that stage, the insect uses the larval form to extract a lot of energy and nutrients to build up on its adult form, which is way faster and still have some of the similar efficiency in terms of energy or nutrient harvesting. And basically what larval form represents is a big chunky model, and the adult form is a smaller model that would perform better at inferencing in terms of speed, but while retaining the accuracy and metrics of the larger chunky model. And I thought that's pretty cool. So he proposed the question, what if we train larger models and then we extract the information from the larger models, so when it comes time for inferencing, we use the smaller models so we can inference faster. You might see some similarities between this and transfer learning, but it really is not the same thing. In transfer learning, we still mostly keep the same architecture, and usually we just swap out the heads for different layers for different tasks. But for knowledge distillation, we're talking about two completely different models, a student and a teacher model that just learn from each other. So this is kind of how knowledge distillation works. This is a softmax function. You might have heard softmax a lot in working with machine learning stuff. It's usually like an activation function. And basically, the temperature here is usually set at 1. So distribution is at like a normal distribution. Not as in normal, but like as in common distribution. And when you increase the temperature, the logits, which are represented by Z, they are smoother. So when you think of, say, a classification model, and the labels are, say, 100, what smoother labels mean would be something like 0.5, 0.2, 0.2, 0.1. Like, if you extract the largest argument, it's still the same output. It's just that the other outputs are not completely 0, and the correct output is not completely 1. And you might be wondering why we use this soft or smooth labeling. Well, that's because when you think about classification, not all things are 100% something. So when you think about cats and dogs classification, well, a dog is 100% dog if you think about the biology, but when you look at the image of the dog, both dogs and cats can have sharp ears, and you can somewhat say if a dog has sharp ears, then it kind of looks like a cat. So the logits at that position should not be 0. It should still retain some characteristics of a cat, which are the sharp ears. And that's why we have also seen label smoothing last week when we talked about regularization. It's just a way of learning stuff without using hard labels. So basically what happens during training is that we have a teacher model, which is the larger, more cumbersome model. It protects soft labels, as all models do. And then there's also a student model, which is the smaller model. And how the student model learns by looking at the soft labels of the teacher and then trying to match the labels from the teacher. And at the same time, it's also looking at the hard labels of the ground truth and then taking a loss function from that. So it's taking loss from both the teacher and the hard label. And from the teacher, it would learn stuff like specific characteristics of, say, in the dogs and cats example, it would not just learn a dog is a dog, but a dog can have sharp ears from the teacher. And from the hard label, you would just learn dog is a dog. If that makes sense. So yeah, basically, the student model is just learning from the outputs of the teacher, but not always from just the hard labels of the ground truth. And that's it for knowledge distillation. We'll go back to vision transformer. I know that some of you here weren't here last week when we covered vision transformer, so I think it'll be a good idea to just recap it, say what it is. So basically in a transformer model, we are used to just getting inputs from text sequence. But when we think about images, they are not texts, they are an image. It's 2D, and it's certainly not a sequence. So basically, the authors wanted to use the transformer model for computer vision without altering the transformer model too much. So he was like, okay, what if we just split the image into patches and then we'll input it as a sequence, which kind of works. And that's how vision transformer is born. Another thing that these authors of the vision transformer model added was these positional encoding, which is different from the transformer model. In a transformer model, the positional encoding is actually just a fixed formula, while in a vision transformer, these positional encodings are learned. So in each position, we have a different matrix that represent the position, which is positional encoding. And then throughout training, it will just learn what, like these patches, where these patches would be in space, and it just learns by itself. So they, for each patch, we throw it into a linear projection, and then we add a positional encoding in, and then feed it into the transformer, and then all of these embeddings would then go into here, where you can predict, I don't know, for example, here would be a classifier for birds and balls and cars. But you can, of course, swap it out for other things. Yeah, this encoder structure is basically the same as the transformer encoder structure within a the original base transformer. It's basically the same thing. It's just the input that's different, and we're only using the encoder part of the transformer. And the problem with this model, which is why we're talking about other models today, the problems of this model is that as it is in a transformer model, the memory requirement is O(n) squared, because all the different members within the sequence have to kind of correlate to have some kind of attention with each other. So you can think of a matrix where everyone has a score with each other. And when we think about O(n) squared, once n gets big, it can get really, really big. And when we think about an image, and when we think about like high resolution images, it can get big really, really easily. So we have to think about ways to make it more efficient. And also for these patches, when we look at bigger patches, then we quickly lose information within it. We don't have as much resolution or as much feature extraction that a CNN would have when we make the patches too big. But when it's too small, then we have too many members within the sequence, which would make the model very inefficient, and it would require a lot of memory in your GPU to train a model, which is never great, especially considering CNNs don't actually aren't that computationally heavy. And one last thing about the vision transformer model is that it requires a lot of training data. This paper is by Google, and they used their own data set for this training, which is the JFT 300 million data set. So there's 300 million images that they collected because Google, and they have to use 300 million images to train a vision transformer, and that's just not great. So there comes DEIT. I do not remember what the long form of DEIT is, but I'm pretty sure distillation is somewhere in it. I guess that's the D. So basically what this model achieved was it was able to train on DFT 1 million, which is the smaller cousin of the Google image data set that it has actually publicly released. And you can see the performance of these models here. So we can see vision transform. B model would just be the base model. The large model would just be the large vision transform model. It's all the way down here, and DEIT was able to outperform them while using less training data, which is great. So a very important concept within DEIT is knowledge distillation that we talked about. And it's the same thing. student learns from the teacher. The student in this case would be a vision transformer, and the teacher in this case is actually pretty fun. It's CNN. It's they used a net called RegNet. So they decided that they would just learn from convolutional neural networks while training these vision transformers. These are just some symbol declaration. But we can see from the model here, it's still kind of very, very similar to a vision transformer. So we still have a class token here, as we have right here. We still have the image patches here, which are here. But we also have a distillation token, which is an extra embedding that this DEIT model has that trains that the model will be able to learn and train later on for the loss of a teacher. Let's talk about the output. So here, what we usually have in a vision transformer is just a head. So we attach it to a normal cross entropy with the hard labels. And on the other end, we have the loss of a teacher, which is when it compares to the soft labels. In a traditional KD, it will just be a soft label from the teacher. But in this paper, they actually used hard distillation for training it. So this is the usual way of training it. So we have two terms here. We separate these terms by lambda. So we have the loss, cross entropy loss of the softmax of the logits. ZS is the kind of the output of the student model. So once you have softmax, then kind of you activate these logits. And there's Y, which is the hard ground truth. Lambda here, you know what lambda is. We have tau here. Tau is actually the same as temperature that we talked about. So remember, the higher the temperature, the smoother the labels. KL is just another loss function. And we softmaxed both the student logits and the teacher logits, and we compare them, their loss. And that's the usual way of doing it, distillation. But this time they actually decided to use hard distillation. So instead of, say, dividing by temperature, they just use whatever the softmax output and then archmax the output and then compare it. So this teacher model would no longer be serving soft labels. It would just be serving 1000 hard labels. So they split into half. You compare half with the ground truth and half with the teacher model. And so I mentioned that the DEIT model is great because it trained on less data. And the reason beyond distillation is that it has regularization, which, as some of you may have known, we usually use regularization for solving like overfitting problems. And regularization is actually pretty nice because we are able to train a more robust model using regularization techniques. We have covered some last week, for example, label smoothing and adding dropout layers, but we're going to cover more this week. So one of the regularization techniques they used is called random erasing. So from each image, they just remove a random portion of it, and it just forces the model to learn more about the surroundings of the image. Stochastic depth. We have learned about dropout, which is when you suddenly like disable some nodes within a layer to make other nodes more robust. And in a stochastic depth, regularization, we actually disable entire layers. It's kind of like dropout, except it's for layers, and we just disable it to make other layers more robust. There's auto augments, which is we know just simple image augmentation techniques such as like rotation or like flipping or like color jittering. What auto augment does is it finds an optimal augmentation for this data set, that hence auto. There's also rand augment, which is when you just have a list of like augmentations and it picks some out of that list to augment the image. It's a pretty classic way of image augmentation. These two are pretty nice. So mix-up is for every batch, we mix two of the images together, or like we mix all like the images together and two at a time. So you would put image one at 50% opacity, and then image two at 50% opacity, and combine them together. And then the model would be asked to predict the combined output of them. So like the average output of them, if that makes sense. You can change it so that one image is at like slightly lower opacity or slightly higher opacity. You just have to change the weight of the output accordingly. But in a mix-up, but we'll be using mix-up today in one of our notebooks, which will be fun. And there's also cut mix, which is when you cut a portion of an image and then stick it in another image. It's also just make it more robust. We don't have an example of this in our notebook because we're not training classification tasks today. We're training regression as is last week. And in the right graph here, we can see that usual distillation, which is normal KDE, we result at a lower accuracy. But when you use hard distillation, you are able to achieve a higher accuracy. And what this symbol means is we attach a distillation token at the end. So remember this model. So in the like usual and hard distillation, they won't have this section of the model. And once they have this symbol, they will have this section of the model. And basically, you just train a distillation embedding to better to feed into the model to absorb the loss from the teacher. And we can see that those actually perform better than usual distillation and soft distillation. Sorry, I mean hard distillation without a distillation token. Another thing to note here in this model is that they actually trained it on a smaller images, and then they fine-tuned it on larger images. And the reasoning for doing that is, as I mentioned before, transformers have a memory requirement of memory complexity of O(n) squared. So when we train on a smaller image, it saves a lot of time and when we're training. So they just upscale it for fine tuning later on. And actually improve the accuracy, which is fun. And these are some comparisons of the teacher and the student accuracy. We can see that the student actually were able to achieve a higher accuracy score than the teacher, which is very interesting, to say the least. And then we will move on to Dino, which is just the coolest paper I've seen. We have some GIFs here. So basically, it was trained on a data set without any labels. And then it's able to grasp what the main subject of that image would be. And then it's just able to learn a lot by itself without people telling it what to do. So it's like this model takes initiative in the workplace to learn, kind of thing. So for example, in this video here, we can see in the attention mask here that it's able to focus on the dog at all times without training on a segmentation task. And on the right here, it's actually, I believe, a clustering algorithm on the trained embeddings of the model. I'm pretty sure it trained on ImageNet, and it's got a lot of classes, and it's able to group classes together without us ever telling it what classes these images should be. So there's actually a clearer representation of that in their paper. So we can see here that able to, the attention mask is very on point. And this is the, okay, it's just a visualization of the classes as represented in Dino. And they used the embedding and they averaged it. And if you have seen text embeddings, usually the closer the embeddings are, the closer to classes are, the closer the two meanings of words. And in this net trained without labels, it's able to tell oh, a baboon is kind of like an chimpanzee, or it's kind of like a monkey, and a lizard is kind of like a chameleon. And you can see that monkeys and chameleons are kind of far apart. Chameleons and snakes are kind of closer, but not as close as lizards, because snakes don't have arms. And it's just really cool to me. Not sure if this is you guys. Okay. Let's move into how this model works. It's actually not exactly a transformer model, because you can see here, there's we did not even mention transformer. The closest thing to transformer is transformation, which is not transformations. If Dino itself is just a way of training it, but in this paper, of course, they used vision transformers to train on with the Dino method. And Dino stands for stealth distillation with no labels, and Di comes from here, and no comes from here. So distillation without labels. So what happens during training is that we get one image, or a batch of image, whatever. We get one image, we augment it 2 ways. So for example, in one image, we make it darker, and the other image will make it lighter. Or in one image, we crop this part out, the other image, we crop another part out. And basically what the objective of this model and this distillation model is that the two models need to be able to tell each other that this is the same image, and they are able to extract the same features from these models, which is pretty neat. We augment it. GS is just the model of a student. We throw the different augmentations into the student model. We throw the different augmentations into the teacher model. And then we propagate the loss of these outputs. So basically, our objective is to get their output as close to each other as possible. So when you put an image in this model, we want the student to be able to tell it's a monkey, and the teacher to be able to tell it's a monkey as well. And basically, yeah, these are just normal loss functions. And then we can see here on the teacher side that this is SG. SG stands for stop gradient. So the teacher doesn't learn from the gradient itself, the student does. And how does teacher learn is by moving average from the student's gradients. So you have an image, two operations, throw them into the model, and then student learn, and then teacher learn from student. And then centering is just a way of, it's kind of like normalization, it's just centering. I realized that once I included the knowledge distillation paper in, this is pretty similar. We can see, this softmax function, this is tau, which is temperature. And it's basically the same thing. In the first few slides, we use Z, which is the voltage from a model, which are the outputs of the model, which is basically the same thing as the sky. Okay, I guess another thing that they have, another augmentation that they have is global versus local props. So the student gets both kinds of props and the teacher gets global props. And what global crop stands for, I think, is when the crop is larger than a certain size, certain proportion of an image, and local crop just be a very local portion of the image. So you can probably tell why these models do not learn as easily as they should, because when we look at this images of this image of two dogs, we have to say this arm is the same as these two dogs. So this is just some results of the Dino model. So as I mentioned, Dino is just a method of training, but there's also the architecture. We can see that they used Dino with the vision transformer. And when we compare it across different ways of unsupervised learning, it actually performed better than the other guys. And the chart here on this side is just a low short learning. So what a low short learning means is that we pre-train it with something else, and then the model is only able to get a few images of each class and be able to tell which class is which without looking at like a copious amount of data. That's what low shot learning means. For example, 5-shot learning, as we've seen last week, means we have 5 images per class to train on. And we can see that Dino is right here. And what frozen means is that after training it within itself without any labels, we freeze the entire architecture, and then we use the embeddings. We feed it into a logistic model, and we train in the logistic model. And it's able to achieve a pretty high result, and they said it's a top 1 accuracy, which is pretty great. And yeah, as you can see here, there's no fine tuning within the model itself. All the weights are frozen. We're just training on this new logistic model, just a question model. And there's also no data augmentation, so it's only just training on those few images. And that's Dino. I don't think we need to cover unit. Actually, let's cover it. I included star here. I went through a lot of revisions today. Somehow still remained in. I originally meant for it to be presented alongside the seg former model, which we are no longer covering. But I guess it's a good architecture to look at. So basically, we can split this model into two halves. It's kind of like a text model. We have encoder, and we have the decoder part. Decoder part would be on the right side, encoder part is on the left side. It's kind of like a transformer. And we can see that with each increasing step in the encoder, the channel number goes higher. Like started from probably 3, because RGB images have 3 channels. We make it 64 channels, 128, and slowly went to 1024. The channels get bigger, and the height width gets smaller. And decoder does the opposite thing. Channels get smaller, and the height width gets bigger, and right back to the original size of the image. And that's all I needed to cover for the unit model. And I'm covering the channel stuff because we'll be looking at it in feature, which is the last model we'll be covering in this reading group. We can see the model architecture here. We can see that it's not purely a vision transformer model. It uses a CNN backbone to extract image features, which I guess makes sense. And then we feed in some positional encoding, which is learned. We concatenate it, and then we throw it into encoder. So you can see like each patches here that we feed into the encoder. The patches here do not represent the same thing as a vision transformer, because in a vision transformer patch was separating images into like squares, but for here we are looking at we are splitting the patches by channel. So an RGB image would have 3 patches, and this vector with 256 channels would have 256 patches. And we feed that in, we get the output, and then we throw it into the decoder. So encoder decoder structure. And we can see these object queries here that we have never seen before. The authors of the paper compared it to positional encodings. And they kind of are, but it's just a way of querying the decoder. These object queries get trained over time. They learn which parts of the image to look at. So think of it as 100. We have 100 object queries here. We have 100 object queries here. We have 100 of these little boxes. Think of it as 100 people asking you different questions about a certain thing, a certain image in this case. So one query would be looking at here and be like, what's on the top left side of the image that is big, or what's on the bottom, or what's in the middle of the figure that's kind of small. And these are some of the object queries visualized. They're not exactly the object queries. They are the predictions of the bounding boxes for each query part. So since we have 100 queries, we actually have 100 outputs. And these are kind of what each output is when we throw it into a visualization. Green means a smaller bounding box, and pink means a bigger bounding box. So we can see that the object query in this specific position actually looks at the left side of the image mark, and they focused on smaller objects. And in this image, we can see that it's focusing on the large objects in the center. So yeah, we feed in these object queries with these encoder embeddings. And then we get the outputs here. We get 100 outputs, which has like a class classification and like the bounding box stuff. And one of the challenges when making this model is looking at the loss function, because when we think about 100 outputs and having it to match with the ground truth, it's actually kind of difficult because what if within those 100 outputs, we have the same thing 100 times? Like we have the seagull 100 times. Would it be considered a good loss or a bad loss? And also, when we look at well, yeah. So basically, and also when we look at different positions, are we saying the position matter or the position doesn't matter? So basically, the answer is position should not matter within the loss, because you can say in the first object query that there's a seagull here, but you can also say in the second object query that there's a seagull, so it shouldn't matter. And also so basically what happens is there's a byport type matching. We look at the 100 inputs and ground truths, and we just kind of match them together, and we take the loss that's the lowest. And whenever, say, there's a repeated output, only one of those would be matched to the ground truth, and the other ones would get penalized within the loss function. These are just some trainings that did in DEIT. They have some like random croppings, decreased learning rate, standard stuff. As are other transformers you've seen in this reading group, it also uses Atom W. So pretty basic these days. And it also did not use SGD as the other models. The other model we discussed last week. And this is a no-brainer. Every time you increase a layer, there's always an increase in performance. Sometimes there's overfitting, but there's always an increase in performance. And there's also we also compared different types of positional encodings in this paper. So they compared, so for encoder, there's like a learns encoding versus a sign encoding, and where the sign encoding is, should it be an up input or for each attention layer? And in the end, they concluded that this combination of positional encoding is the best. And we can see that in different transformer models. You have different ways of using positional encoding. And furthermore, in the results, they talked about how they can use the image embeddings as extracted and then change the head a little bit. They changed it into a CNN, and they were able to do segmentation, semantic segmentation instead of like bounding box projection. Oh, I included this image here because it's pretty fun. We can see these like glowy legs and glowy hair. These are the attention within the image. And we can see that it focuses a lot of attention on the extremities of zebra, because when we think about bounding box, we only want to like look at the sides so we can get the bounding box position right. So yeah, the attention is right at the edge, and it actually performed pretty well even when it's overlapped by another animal. So you can see that it's actually still bounding box pretty well. This image I included here because it's pretty funny. They basically talked about how even in weird image positions, or like in images with a lot of objects, it's still able to predict pretty well. So in this image, they have like a lot of giraffes, and they still are able to identify all the giraffes in the picture. even though it's like uncommon within like there's definitely no image in the data set that has like 20 zebras in sorry, giraffes in the image, but they were able to generalize well and be able to capture all the objects, all the animals. Cool. That's all the models. We can look at the notebooks now. We don't have a lot of time. Okay. So there are two notebooks. Neither of the notebooks are trained particularly well because I want you guys to try kind of as a take-home assignment to fine-tune these models and also fix kind of some of the errors that I made within these models. Mixer comparison. I can go through what I did in here. So last week we covered the conv mixer, which is a model that took like the length of a tweet to implement, and I was able to find like a pre-trained weight for this model. So I decided to fine-tune it on this popularity dataset that we also used last week. So as always, we have these image augmentations. We have the data set. These are the same as last week. The model is not the same as last week. You can see that it's mostly using these convolution, no layers, and then it's just a mixer. And there's also these residual layers. Visualization is the same thing. We can see how the model is loaded here. And then I changed the output of the conv mixer to reflect what our task is. So I made the output 1 because it's a regression task and we're just looking at the score of that one node in the end. I also froze some of the layers, some of the parameters, so we have more space for training. But and also because when we fine-tune like an image model, we usually freeze most of the parameters and we leave the head for fine-tuning. Yeah, we used Atom W for this one. Blah blah blah. We can see that the first try at first step at solving this model is not great, and you can also see that I actually changed the losses loss function here this time. It's different from last time because for this time I tried to match it with the criteria within the Kaggle competition that this data set is from. So I think it wanted a root mean squared error. So I multiplied the logits by 100 and then I root the mean squared error to get this loss. So yeah, like I said, this is not a great trained model because you can see, yeah, the train accuracy is improving, but it's also overfitting because the test accuracy is decreasing very, it's not rapidly decreasing, but you can see it's kind of stagnant at around 50% accuracy. And it's the same thing for loss. So the training loss is healthily decreasing, but the test loss is just slightly increasing. So this is some terrible overfitting. So we should use some regularization and some dropouts. So I noticed in the model that they didn't have dropouts, so I added some dropout layers. I also added the weight decay in the learning rate. So in here we added a weight decay. And then in the model itself, the model is down here because I moved it. I added some dropout layers. Oh, and also just a fun thing, I spent a lot of time just looking at this, training this model because when we use just the model as I copied it from GitHub, it actually made the test loss really, really huge. And that's because PyTorch has a problem with a very small batch size and having batch norm at the same time. And the loss is just really, really huge, and we had to make add these parameters to make it perform normally. So as I just said, dropout, we train it again, and we can see it here. So started from 25-ish and it decreased down to 19. It's not great, but it's a good improvement because we can see that it's still gradually decreasing. The loss is gradually decreasing. Accuracy is increasing, and we can see that they're kind of increasing and decreasing at the same rate, the train and test sets. But we can see that we ended at 19. It's still not as good as 18. So yeah, that's just what a healthy curve looks like. So I decided to just fine tune it slightly more. I added a scheduler in here. Did I add a scheduler in here, or is it later? What did I do in this one? Oh, I think I just modified the learning rate a little bit, and then I trained it again. It's kind of the same results. So the learning rate is not the main problem here. I added a mix-up function, and as I mentioned within the lecture, a mix-up function is just when you mix two images together, mix the scores together, and you propagate loss. It's just a regularization technique to combat overfitting. We don't really have the overfitting problem anymore, but I guess it's just a neat way to show you guys what a mix-up function looks like. It's just opacity times the image, and you add them together. And for this try, I used SGD instead of RMW to see if I can maybe just train for more epics and see if it results in a slightly lower loss. We also added a scheduler. You can see that I started training, but I stopped because training loss, even at epic 6 is 7, it's pretty large. So as an assignment, you can fine tune this model. The first step I would do when fine tuning this model is finding a better learning rate for these. So because you can see that the loss is decreasing very, very slowly, whereas in the other training tests, you can see that it starts with like a 20. So yeah, swapping out the learning rate, and there's a free neat tool that we're introducing this week that we can find, and where we can find an optimal learning rate. It's called PyTorch Lightning. I saw it in like a few research paper and decided to just try it out because it looks fun, but it's not like properly implemented. Okay, we can see here that in PyTorch Lightning, the main difference is just declaring the model. So usually in a just PyTorch, we would just declare a model by itself and the forward function. But in the PyTorch Lightning model, we would also look at the optimizers will have functions for a training step, what a training step and the test step would look like. We have to include the loss function in there. We can see that the loss function is not the root mean squared loss. So maybe you guys can see that when you're at home as an assignment. But basically the learning rate finder is here. So we can just load the trainer, we load the model in, which is a DEIT model. This is not context variance. This is the DEIT model. Load the trainer, and then we find the learning rate. And we find that for this specific model, this is a good place to start. And I don't remember if they. Okay, so this is a log base. So I think it's like 2e-7. Okay, great. Wait, learning rate to start. So that's what I passed in. And there's some training results, and you can also use TensorBoard pretty easily with PyTorch Lightning. I forgot to log the test accuracy and test loss in this model. So it's also something that you can keep in mind when you're looking at improving this notebook further. Cool. And that's all the materials I have this week, and also just right on time. Do you guys have any questions? Well, okay. Yeah, this is the last week. Thank you guys so much for attending this reading group. And yeah,